Lesson that we began last Sunday from the book of Job. This comes from the 38th chapter. Let us listen for God's word. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm and said, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, here we are? Who gives the ibis wisdom or gives the rooster understanding? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of the heavens when the dust becomes hard and the clods of earth stick together? Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in a thicket? Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for a lack of food? This is the word of the Lord. Destruction's sight was bragging that he could outdo anyone in an act of strength. And he made a special case of making fun of an older workman. After several hours of teasing, the older man had had enough, and he said to the young whippersnapper, "Why don't you put your money where your mouth is? I'll bet you a week's wages that I can haul something in this wheelbarrow over to that outbuilding that you won't be able to wheel back." Well, the young man said, "You're on, old man. It's a bet. Let's see what you've got." So the older man reached out and grabbed the wheelbarrow by the handles, and then nodding to the young man said, "Get in." This week's Old Testament and Gospel passages speak to the human tendency toward arrogance about our knowledge and our misconception that we have the ability to control the forces that are at work in our lives. When Job, who has had all manner of suffering inflicted on him, finally demands that God answer himself, God answers Job's complaint with an intimidating voice out of a whirlwind. As you heard Dick say over in the gospel, the disciples James and John exhibit a similar tendency. They're pestering Jesus about whether they can look forward to a VIP status in heaven. We humans like to think that we have all the answers, that everything is under our control, that if we just massage the formula a little bit, we can have it all. We're not very different from Job, and we can face a similar fate as Job. As we meet Job this morning, we find that he has lost everything near and dear to him. His flocks are stolen, his servants are put to the sword, celestial flames engulf his sheep, his children are crushed in a windstorm, his skin burns with open sores and adding insult to injury. His 3 best friends inform him that it's all because of the evil that he must have done. That's why he's suffering. It's his fault. In today's world, Job is all around us. Persons in danger of losing their home to foreclosure, persons who have been laid off and are sending out resume after resume after resume without any response, persons with impossible to pay health care bills that are all stacked up on the dining room table. One's experiencing all kinds of varieties of brokenness. It feels like a modern-day Job. Our lives are altered by larger forces beyond our control, and Job is the poster boy for modern life gone wrong. Like Job, the forces that change our lives are invisible to us, sometimes beyond our ability to change, and often even beyond our ability to understand. And so the iconic figure of Job shows up as our neighbors, as our co-workers, as our family members, even as ourselves. The huge question echoing this morning picks up where we left off last Sunday. And today the question is, why? Excuse me, God, are you listening to me? Are you out there somewhere listening to me? Why? Our passage today finds God answering the questions that Job has been asking all along. It also shows us the other face of God. God speaks to Job not with a satisfying explanation for all of his woes, but with more questions and a reminder that God is God. The surprise is that in asking the questions, Job does come face to face with God. Imagine that. Imagine that. Coming face to face with God. Job has demanded a hearing with God. He wants a chance to say his piece. He has requested a divine audience before whom he can state his case. And rather like in a courtroom, Job envisions stating his plea and hearing a direct response from God. Instead, Job receives a profound series of lines about God's power and God's majesty. And it all comes in the forms of questions. God says, have you ever visited the storehouse of the hail? Do you tell the antelope when to calve? Have you ever tried to teach the hawks to fly? While you people are busy with your crazy little world, doing all of your craziness, I'm busy trying to keep creation happening, and I'll tell you it's not easy. There's a store manager who overheard a clerk saying to a customer, no ma'am, we haven't had any now for weeks, and it doesn't look like we're going to be getting any in soon. And alarmed by what was being said, the manager rushed over to the customer who was just walking out the door and said, ma'am, no, that's not true. Of course we'll have some soon. In fact, we placed an order for it just a couple of weeks ago. And then the manager drew the clerk aside and said, never, 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 never say we don't have something. If we don't have it, say we ordered it and it's on its way. Now, what was it she wanted? And the clerk said, rain. With exquisite detail, the story of Job wants us to pause and to think about God's awesomeness. It is amazing. It is magnificent and not at all clearly relevant to Job's complaints. Job is far less concerned with answering what has suddenly become a rather petty complaint, and instead recounts an incredible litany of the wonders of the universe, reminding us that God is behind and within it all. It is God who not only created the world so long before, but also is intimately involved with creation, even down to the smallest detail. As human beings, we seem to have an amazing tendency for wanting to place God in a box. We have a strong preconceived notion of what God must look like, of God's name, of God's gender, and all of the things that God does. We can be convinced that we know who God likes and dislikes and what God's opinion is regarding the bulk of creation. We would like God to follow our schedule and answer to us. And Job has modeled this for us hugely. But God says, you will not put me in a box. You will not do that. Just look at who I am and what I have done and what I do now, and you will realize how crazy it is to try to put me in a box. When we are able to do this, our relationship with God smooths over. God is unchanging, still able to claim his brute knowledge and control over things that we cannot access. Although it's an uncomfortable lesson, we need to remember we are creature. We are creature and God is creator. This leads to humility. This leads to eternal perspective. It leads to submission and dependence. Instead of running around and around and around and around and creating a storm, the storm can actually stop. We can leave God with justice and fairness to clean things up. God has more than enough power for us if we will allow it. God can take the struggles of our life and transform them. A poet wrote these words. There once was an oyster whose story I tell, who found that sand had gotten under his shell. Just one little grain, but it gave him much pain. For oysters have feelings, although they're so plain. Now did he berate the workings of fate, which had led him to such a deplorable state? Did he curse out the government, call for an election? No, as he lay on the shelf, he said to himself, if I cannot remove it, I'll try to improve it. So the years rolled by, as the years always do, and he came to his ultimate destiny, stew. And that small grain of sand which had bothered him so was found to be a beautiful pearl, all richly aglow. Now this tale has a moral, for it isn't grand, what an oyster can do with a morsel of sand. What couldn't we do if we'd only begin with all of the things that get under our skin? When we aren't running around and around and around trying to control the world, we can stop and invite God in to give some control and to make some sense out of our lives. How many of you have ever watched a hamster in its cage? You ever watch a hamster in its cage? Most of the time in the cage they have those exercise wheels, and the hamster runs and runs and runs and runs and runs and runs and runs, but doesn't get very far. And people who have hamsters as pets, they play with them and they talk to them. But the hamster, it doesn't understand human thoughts, it doesn't understand plans or feelings or accomplishments. There's no way the hamster can grasp what we think and we do. Compared to God, at times, we are like hamsters on a wheel. Compared to God, our understandings are extremely limited. But God is God. And the final analysis, that is the simple truth of it all. When we can accept that, we can bring questions and wondering. We can bring hopes. We can bring all manner of feelings into the presence of God. God will take them. God will cherish them. And God will still be God through it all. And those days, when we really feel like a hamster on a wheel, running and running and running and running and getting nowhere, know that God is there. That God is there. God is there loving us and trying to guide us. We just need to stop the running, to listen to the one who created us and this entire world, the one who even dares to recreate. Amen.